Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla. Welcome back to another episode of Highside, Lowside. Today I'm being joined yet again by Joe Zito.
Hi.
And also with Spurgeon today. Now, for those of you who are listening, for those of you who are listening to this rather than checking it out in video, I would like to ask Spurgeon to both describe your shirt and then also maybe give a little explanation.
There's nothing to explain. It's an AutoZone t-shirt, and if you're not in the zone, you're not with us.
Get in the zone!
AutoZone! I wish I was getting kickback for this. This is just to poke fun at our commenters.
Nothing at all. Alrighty, so today the topic we've got at hand is actually one I feel very strongly about, and I incidentally, fellas, feel very strongly about my very moderate position on this topic. We're talking about motorcycle technology. We're wondering if it's come a little bit too far on motorcycles. Let's hash out right now, what exactly constitutes technology on a motorcycle?
For me, I would say that it is kind of anything considered a rider aid.
Okay.
Somewhere where a computer steps in and maybe manipulates your input to have the bike handle better, stop better, something like that.
It's funny because now that's what we look at technology, but when we were first kind of discussing this, it was like, I remember the big shift to fuel injection, right? And that to me was like the first, move into technology was motorcycles all became fuel injected, and there's very few carbureted versions left. Even, Joe talking about his debate between getting a carbureted dirt bike versus a fuel injected dirt bike.
Time out. We just finally managed to work in a new dirt
I brought it
bike.
up
I know we
this
managed to
time.
work in a new dirt bike.
I handed the low ball in there for him
Continue.
to talk about his new bike, but I think for me, it started with fuel injection. ABS, I remember when ABS first kind of came out, there was an article, and I forget which magazine it was, when the CBR 600 got ABS, and there was this big comparison about how better it could stop, and all the hardcore sport bike guys were like, no, we don't want that on motorcycles, and now you see, any of the sport bikes that are out there are the ones that are leading the charge with all the greatest technology available, keeping the bike in line.
I think we have to remember that technology has been sort of injected into motorcycles from day one. Let's look at a tire, right? A computer generated tread pattern. Is that technology? Is that like overwhelming technology? I think most people wouldn't necessarily balk at that. You talked about fuel injection sort of being the beginning of it. I don't know. I think it goes back way earlier than that. Look at electric starting, right? Like that was technology that hit motorcycles. Or even rewind farther than that, electric headlights. Acetylene carbide. That's where it. But I guess that's my point. Is
my headlight's out of fuel. I can't ride home till the morning.
I think so. I agree with you, and I think that the really where the debate's kind of coming now is that technology has gotten to the point where it's so far, right? We're no longer like trying to figure out how to put a headlight on a motorcycle. Now it's like, how do we slow this down? We've built these bikes so crazy fast. How do we control this power? So now the technology has shifted into more of harnessing, all this power that's being
It's
created.
not really boosting the power, but it's harnessing.
But in fairness, you could go back to like, frame design and how they, they had these crazy engines in the 70s that were so much more powerful than the suspension and the frame could handle. So I think it's always been this evolution of trying to harness that in.
Just to rewind 1 second to your point there, let's play the obverse side of that coin. You could make the argument that electric headlights you could go faster at night. You wouldn't outrun an acetylene lamp. So I guess when I'm thinking about technology, I just think of it, I guess, a little bit more broadly. And motorcycles have always been kind of intertwined with technology, and that's what's made them different over the years. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, depending on who you are, what you're doing. All right, guys, let's move on to the next one. Why, specifically, do we see such a rapid proliferation of tech on motorcycles? I think we started into this, but I think there's some other reasons, too.
I think part of it is marketing, of course. Having all the bells and whistles helps sell a machine, of course. But also, I think motorcycles are fighting an uphill battle at this point because it's tough to get people into things that are dangerous. So obviously, the more things that a bike can offer to keep a rider safe or keep people on the road without, as much risk as possible, I think that's going to help sell bikes. The AMA did a study and said that riders without ABS are twice as likely to crash. That's pretty wild.
So that's kind of where the technology thing bothers me, right? Where it's like, these are rider aids. You still need to learn how to ride the bike. I don't mind having these on the bike as a little bit of an extras. It's a safety extra. But I don't think they should ever replace the fundamentals of learning how to really ride and control your bike. Yes, ABS is there in those emergency, 3% situations to kind of help you out. But I don't think traction control or ABS should really be something that you rely upon. But to your question,
let me tell you back in the hot seat. Yeah, why is it proliferating?
I think it really is because of government regulations. So I was having a conversation about why there's all these different modes on the bikes for throttle. Like, if you want to be able to turn ABS off with like the way the new Euro 5 regulations are set up, you have to have like, enduro mode on the BMWs allows you to shut the ABS off at the rear wheel or shut traction control off. If it was just a pure street bike, you have to have a loophole to get around this. So I think it really comes back to government regulations for a lot of it.
I can't speak to that. I'm not particularly familiar with that, but I can speak to how Europe affects our regulations here. So, at this point in time, ABS, for instance, is not mandatory on an American motorcycle.
Right.
However, because it is mandatory in in other markets, Europe in particular, they have to make a bike with an ABS option. So even the laws of another country may be dictating what you can or cannot purchase, simply because it's not economically efficient for them to, for a manufacturer necessarily to have two different flavors of a bike, an export version and a depending on country. The other thing I think that is important for people to realize too is that tech is also proliferating too, and this kind of relates to that. But from an economic standpoint, it just doesn't always make sense. Like Joe and I had talked about manual transmissions in cars. I mean, I think many people are paying more money for a manual transmission. At this point, let's be honest, an automatic probably outclasses a manual in many of the areas where a manual might have won out before. But now, if you want that manual transmission, you have a much smaller selection of vehicles to find it with, right, and you're gonna pay extra for it. And I think for a lot of people, something like it would not surprise me in the future to see perhaps a non-ABS version of a bike, if it's even offered in America, potentially cost more, even though it needs fewer parts.
Well, so it's not here yet, but I think as soon as the government gets involved in like, hey, we're going to recommend this, like,
I think one thing to consider relative to the automatic versus manual transmission in cars is like, the more popular something becomes and the more economical it is for a factory to make a certain thing, the better it's going to get. So obviously, I think that once ABS becomes mandatory, we're going to have more of the more advanced ABS, the lean angle and all the different traction control. Like now we're seeing BMW and KTM have the hill holder set up, which is really neat, especially on a big touring bike or an adventure bike. So I think, it kind of stinks to be forced into something like that, but it also is kind of better for all the R&D.
Sure. Now, I'll also toss out one that's, I think, super obvious, but I think the other reason we see this rapid proliferation of tech is because people like it. It's funny, we've seen comments, on our articles and some of the videos where people will kind of talk about, ABS is a great example. I did not even realize how many people there are out there who simply won't even consider the purchase of a bike if it doesn't have ABS. And I think that a lot of people get into sort of and we do it too when we're testing a bike for sure, we run through, all of the modes and all of the different features. But if you guys are anything like I am, and I think you are, you find something that works kind of well, and that's like sort of how you dial the bike in and just leave it there. And I suspect that most other people do that too, but let's also not just shortchange the fact that people like this stuff and it must be working pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it right there. People like it.
People like it. Let's get that out of the way. All right, fellas. Is it okay to have inclusion of tech be the law of the land? Sub-question, if not, should there be some sort of legal protection in this country, other countries, you answer however you want, should there be some sort of protection for the rider who says, nope, I want a bike that is, an older bike without electronic help?
What do you mean some sort of protection for that person?
I mean legal protection. Should their right to ride a bike without, some sort of an electronic rider aid be protected?
Well, I'm never going to argue that the government should be able to tell you what to do from a technology standpoint, but unfortunately we're past that point in time in society. As far as should their right to want to do that be protected, absolutely. But then you get into insurance costs and things like that, because the insurance companies are really what's dictating a lot of that speak. Even when we talked about an episode or two ago, when we talked about the lawsuits that happen, you crash at a dirt bike track and all of a sudden now you're allowed to sue somebody. It's like, I think you have to be willing to accept some of that risk for yourself. If I'm going to do that, I accept that risk. But then it gets into insurance companies as well as the government.
Yeah, I think that's kind of just where we're at, unfortunately. It's like very litigious society. People are looking to point the blame, point the finger on somebody else whenever they get hurt. So yeah, I agree. The government really shouldn't force you to have to buy extra technology. But when you really step back and look at the big picture, most of this kind of stuff you could turn off or you could override once you get the bike anyway. You know, it's only a few $100 at this point for even some of the most advanced ABS models. If ABS is helping people not hurt themselves or not damage their property or not damage other people's property, man, you know, we're just going to have to swallow it. That's just, it is how it is.
And if it comes down to the government saying we have to have this or we can't ride motorcycles, I'll take it all day long. You know, if the government's going to say, like, you have to have this on bikes because that's what's going to make it acceptable and safe, well, fine. I mean, I've ridden 80% of the newest bikes out there, and those rider aids have never once hindered me from having a good time. I'm not gonna lose any sleep about the government saying you have to have rider aids in the bike, because frankly, so many of them work so well at this point that, like, I'm okay with it.
My take on it is that, like, most of my motorcycles at this point still have mechanical drum brakes.
Right.
For me, advanced brakes is a twin leading shoe drum.
You're opting more, I guess, to have bikes be grandfathered in.
Yeah. Choose your level of technology. You know, you could buy a bike from the 60s and, you know, oh man, if you get an electronic ignition for that bike instead of the points, whew, you're really hot dogging.
You're leading the technical curve.
Should you be allowed then to strip your bike back? Should you be allowed to legally take the ABS off of your bike if you wanted, for instance? Or
that's where the insurance companies come into play, right? Like, you crash, and it's like, well, what happened with the ABS? Oh, well, I took the ABS off the bike. Does the insurance company at that point get the right to nullify your claim, and now all of a sudden you're stuck with a bill? So we're getting.
I don't know. I'm asking the questions around here. Don't answer my question with a question.
But I think
you make a good point. I don't know.
But now
about
it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Now, so again, I have the option on all of my bikes to turn the ABS off, or I just don't have ABS.
So you think that it's okay if they make it the law of the land, but you just want to be able to turn it off?
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, that's the way it is.
But what's the difference between turning it off and just removing it?
Well, it's still there.
It's still there.
But it's doing the same thing, which is nothing at all.
Well, for me, honestly, you know, like, I know we don't really like to get into too many of my personal stories, but
I love your personal stories.
Ladies and gentlemen,
that's why these fine folks show up for the podcast and/or videos.
You've made them wait 15 minutes to be able to hear your
sorry.
personal story.
all right. So
Does this involve your dirt bike?
no.
Once upon a time, star.
All right.
Once upon a time, my first ABS-equipped motorcycle was my Tiger 800 XC. It's a 2012, so it's still kind of like an early-ish ABS. So one time after work with another guy here, we went to go rip in the pines, and man, we were hauling maybe 40 miles an hour down like a Jeep road, and you know, he was on a WR, and we came up on a downed tree. So he just stabbed the rear brake, slid the bike, went around the log, no big deal. Well, I didn't turn the ABS off on the Tiger, and I go to stab the rear brake thinking I could pitch it sideways, and it just didn't skid. So here I'm about to center punch this tree at 40 miles an hour, and I panic, you know. But I downshift, and I managed to dump the clutch enough to get the thing to slide, and I got it around the tree. But man, I like had a heart attack. You know, I was just thinking like, well, this is one time where the ABS really would have hurt me. So then, you know, I figured it's a little bit of a pain in the to go through there and shut the ABS off. But for that day, I said, okay, you know, I'm going to shut it off so I could ride it like a normal dirt bike and get the back end to get pitched around and everything. Fast forward on to this past summer, I did the Mid-Atlantic Backcountry Discovery Route with Peter. And a lot of that was like logging roads and Jeep roads and just kind of gravel. But there was a lot of switchbacks, you know, like some really steep stuff. And the back wheel wanted to keep locking up as I was coming around, and I was fully loaded with my luggage and everything like that. And I'm like, oh man, you know, and I kept turning the ABS off because I was off-road. So then I was like, all right, let me try with the ABS on. And then immediately it was 1,000% better. Then I'm like, oh, cool, you know, I could really hammer on the front brake and thinking I can trust it to stop even on this pea gravel and stuff. So even in those two different scenarios.
They're rider aids.
Yeah.
And you have to learn how to use them.
Yeah, right.
It's not just walking in with a hammer and saying, all right, I'm gonna go fix this job and this is the only tool that I have.
Right.
Each one of those is a little tool in your arsenal, and you can figure out when you need to use them.
Yeah.
But I think that puts the onus back on the rider to be able to learn how to use the technology.
Right.
I think that's a really good example.
Okay. All right.
You're welcome for my story.
Yeah, thank you for your story, Joe.
That was a great story. So I'm going to throw you guys, I guess, kind of a softball here. What are the benefits of some of this tech, some of these rider aids as you see them?
Less crashing.
All right.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
It's pretty good. Fewer crashes is definitely something.
I also think the TFT dash. You know, when you look at whether we're talking about rider aids or some of the technology on there, I think the TFT dashes help to make things a little bit clearer, and they do help to control the rider aids depending on how far they go. Like, I think for me, it's just kind of like learning how to set up and program the bike the way that I want it to operate.
I'm going to disagree with you for just a second, and not strongly because I don't feel super strongly about it, but I'm disagreeing for some of the voiceless out there in listener land.
Okay.
Some of those TFT dash setups are pretty complex. Like to the point where like I don't think they're simplifying anything. Like I have a number of motorcycles that have no functional dash on them.
Sure.
Some of them have no dash at all on them.
Right, but if you want the information, those bikes don't give you the information. With all the new technology, the TFT dashes help to organize the information.
That is true, but sometimes I'm getting too much information, and because I think there are varying levels of customizability to those dashes. However, I will say that not all of those are necessarily serving up info as I think in a way that's always helpful.
Again, I think there's a give and a take there, but I do think that in some cases it helps.
I think we're in a bit of a transitional era too, because all of us, kind of grew up on bikes that just had analog everything and buttons and knobs and now the new folks that are getting into riding have grown up just seeing menu screens and having a directional pad, almost like a video game to get through the different menus. And I think that as we age out, the new generation coming in is going to be like, oh yeah, of course, go into this menu, this mode, whatever.
It helps them to identify with it, right? It helps a younger generation to identify, oh, I want to get into motorcycles because I understand that.
I can't agree with your point more strongly, and I actually wanted to kind of move back and highlight something you said, where we're in a transitional period. I remember one of the bikes we tested recently, or somewhat recently, was a BMW K1600B. Phenomenal motorcycle.
Monster.
However, there were some parts about that bike that confused me greatly, and actually it was the mix of buttons, like standard buttons that had a single control and they did one thing, and other items where I'd have to go into a menu, a sub-menu to find it. I can deal with either one of those, but the way they were integrated was very confusing, and I didn't know where I was supposed to look for what thing.
This is where the tech that's supposed to save you is backfiring. Because now, like I saw a YouTube video recently where the dude jamming down the highway on an adventure bike, and he's obviously not looking where he's going, and he slams into the rear of a car because he's looking at his dash and he's going through his menus or whatever. You know what I mean? So now it's like, on top of all the distractions of like, oh, the radio is crap or the windshield isn't adjusted properly, like all the stuff that we don't think of when we're riding our old bikes because it's just not an option.
I think one of the things that I always try to, instill in people is like spend some time with your bike before you out and ride it. Know how to turn it.
Read the friggin' owner's manual.
Yeah, read the owner's manual.
There's so much good stuff in there that nobody ever reads.
But that's the problem is that like I see so many guys where I'll go out for a ride with somebody and they'll be like trying to figure it out while they're riding the bike. It's like, whoa,
it's
just
dangerous,
like
man.
hang out for 15 minutes in the parking lot before you ride the bike, figure out what you need to do, and then go ride it.
If you look at the dash for 2-3 seconds, you're covering a lot of ground.
2-3 seconds, you're already,
All right, so we gave you that meatball. Now I'll give you another meatball, but it's just the opposite. What are some of the drawbacks technology? You talked about a guy smashing into a truck playing this menu.
I think
that seems pretty obvious.
We've answered that question. Yeah.
One, it's distracting. I think one that, if you're not the kind of person to really sit down and study the manual and sit in your garage and mess with it and figure it all out before you hit the road, you're going to find yourself in a scenario where you're trying to get through the menus and change your suspension settings or whatever while you're jamming down the road, and you might get yourself in a pickle. You might run a red light or something like that, or even worse.
I'm just wincing. Like if you're doing that, that's silly. Don't do that.
Yeah, but people do all the time.
But they shouldn't do that.
I think the biggest problem you see is it makes the bikes harder to work on yourself. If you like working on bikes yourself, it almost kind of impedes you from really tackling that. Other than like changing brake pads and even then you can screw up the ABS system when you're trying to change brake lines or something like that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing where people are like, man, I just want to be able to work on my own bike. Like if you want to do a lot of the regular maintenance yourself, the bikes have become pretty complicated.
Really? Like your regular average Joe maintenance for a pretty technology-laden bike.
Dude, I just did the big service on my Tiger and computers were involved. And it was kind of scary for a guy who's worked on about 1 million motorcycles over my whole lifetime.
Sure. Did you power through it?
I powered through it, but man, I mean, it was a steep learning curve for me to get the program on the laptop, get the licensing and all that crap figured out, get it to talk to the bike, sync the throttle bodies, go through all the codes and all that. Like it was way more complex. I probably could have rebuilt the top end on one of my.
And I would argue that
Triumphs
Joe is a pretty advanced mechanic compared to the average, person.
I was on the struggle bus, man. I was in there with.
The adverse to that is that. If you want to take it to the shop and you can't figure out what's wrong with it, they can plug a computer in, type a few keys and be like, okay, well, this is the problem.
It helps diagnose. But the other thing I was going to say too is, I think you're also like, Triumph makes that a proprietary system. Like that's their choice. Like, look at the automotive vehicle world, right? Like OBD2 is kind of a standard, and like you don't really. There are some things where you're going to need very specialized computer equipment to fix things, but that's not necessarily.
Yeah, you could read codes on a lot of bikes now with the standard automotive
that's
reader.
not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily the case. I would just make the argument that I don't know that electronics greatly complicate things. Sometimes
I think it's just a potential fail point, right? Like there's something else to go wrong on the bike.
There's something else to go wrong on mechanical bikes. Look at all the mechanical bull that we own. It never runs right. I guarantee anything that's in your garage was more reliable than anything in one of ours.
I think the other thing too, when we're talking about downsides to this, is that I still, and I mentioned this earlier, but I think too many people rely on it. And I think it is and I'm not going to stress that enough. It's a rider aid. Still, you have to learn how to ride the bike.
Yeah, you're not guaranteed no crashing.
Exactly. It's not going to save your life if you don't know what you're doing. Right. Like it's there to help you in an emergency panic situation.
I don't disagree with either of you boys, but I'm surprised nobody has mentioned the actual experience of riding a motorcycle. I'm sure that's what some of these people who are watching and or listening are thinking. I know that riding some old junker that come out of my garage is a little different experience than when I saddle up on the latest and greatest thing that the manufacturers have provided for us to review. Totally different experiences for me. Both of them wonderful, but just very, very different. Do you guys have any thought on that?
It can be kind of like watered down. It can be a watered down experience versus, like if you get on an old bike from the 60s, it vibrates, it may be a little bit hard to start. You can lock up the drum brake on it.
Yeah, watered down is not the.
But even to your point, like I don't think it ruins the motorcycle experience whatsoever.
I don't think it ruins it, but it definitely does change it. If nothing else, I think we can all agree that it is different being on a very heavily, technological, a tech forward heavy, I guess, bike, I would say. But it's definitely different.
I don't know. The wheelie control on the Speed Triple watered down my wheelie ability on that bike.
Yeah, you turn it. Like, I don't know. Like I think for me that's not necessarily one of the detriments.
Yeah, when I'm on a real tech laden bike, there's lots of times that's where I'll throw my wife on the back because the bike's likely to be a little more comfortable.
It's more powerful.
Adjusting the suspension becomes much quicker, so we're likely to have a better ride. Whereas if I was on something mechanical, I might just leave the preload where it is, and she's getting beaten to death back there. I think about how much easier, to your point, the ride can be if I'm not pushing it. Gives you time to see the sights, kind of do some other stuff. I was laughing because we were on a trip not long ago where I had a GPS that was able to find places to eat. So I would kind of pull those up as we were gunning down the highway, lean over so my wife could look at them, and then she was yelping them on her phone, which was kind of hilarious. Obviously not the experience you're going to get on an old bike, but it did definitely change our riding experience. I would say in that instance for the better. And I don't know that I'd want to be ripping around on a rigid panhead trying to yelp.
I don't think she would want to be ripping around a rigid panhead.
Jim's Crab Shack or whatever. But all right, you guys feel like one more question, or we want to call this thing quits?
I think we got one more.
Let's go.
Got one in you? All right, let's finish it off. So this is gonna be very personal. I'm sure we're gonna hear from our audience on this one as well. Which pieces of tech do you personally want and not want on your own motorcycle?
I want ABS. I've come to like it now.
Okay.
I think it's super important, and I think that
front wheel, rear wheel, both, only neither.
I think that for the bikes that I ride, I think for adventure bikes, being able to shut off the rear with one button like the Africa Twin is super nice compared to the Tiger where you got to go through all these menus, or at least on my early one.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to ride a super gnarly sport bike or a naked bike, being able to have those different rider modes, and I heard Ducati's got a slide control now, so you could really be a hooligan.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's super cool.
Do you want fuel injection?
Oh, of course. That's a given.
All right, so we have fuel injection.
Yeah.
throttle modes? Do you find throttle modes useful? Like, is that something you enjoy?
You just
or?
keep asking him more questions now. He's
Well, because I feel like, all right, he wants
answered
ABS,
your
I got
question,
that,
yeah.
but like, I expected you guys were going to spec me out this motorcycle
I like
that
all
nobody
of it.
builds.
Like, I think for me, it's like I don't have a problem with any of it. I do think that there's certain tech that works better than others. Like the rider modes. I think my biggest gripe with the rider modes is throttle response. I think there's times where, as long as
a
I
lot
can,
of those can be tailored. You
some
can
of
take,
some of
I know,
them
but you can take a
can be
rider mode
tailored.
and then you can change the
Some
throttle
of them
response
you
given
can,
it.
yes.
Yeah.
But I guess my problem is there's certain bikes where it's like no matter what you do, it's a very on-off throttle response. And there's other bikes that I ride where it's like, man, this is perfect, in those rider modes. So for me, it's still very much like ride the bike and see which manufacturer is doing it the best. But as far as any of the technology,
Doesn't everybody think that though? With something like throttle modes, oh, this one's too touchy. Oh, this one isn't responsive
but
enough.
I guess that's my
well,
point.
that one's just right.
But that's my point. Is that like go out and find the one that you like and ride it. It's the same as buying a bike. Back in the day before there was any of the technology. You played around with them, you saw which one you liked, and you went out and that's the one I'm going to go with. Like for me, I'll take all the technology. It doesn't bother me at all. Like there's not a bike that I've ridden where I'm like I feel like this technology is ruining my experience on the motorcycle. I don't like the government telling me that I have to have it, but at this stage in the game,
We got an outlaw here, folks. Get in the zone.
I think what's cool,
Destroyed your point.
kind of to your point there. I think one cool thing to come of all this is I've been seeing a lot of manufacturers offer demo days. Even maybe 10, 15 years ago, like you kind of just had to walk into a dealership and buy a bike based on what you read in a magazine.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. 10, 15 grand, just from reading articles.
I was talking to.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you 1 second. I was just thinking the same thing as you were talking, actually, because when you were talking about, you got to find something you like and run with it, it makes the demo ride that much more important, especially knowing how long it takes us to get settled in on a new tech-heavy bike that a manufacturer has sent us. Man, I can't encourage those of you out there in the audience strongly enough to find a way to get on one of these bikes.
Any manufacturer that's not offering that now.
And that's the thing is like people are like, well, they only let me ride it for 10 minutes. That's enough. Like if I can ride, as long as I know that the throttle response is good, I can run through a couple things. Like that at least lets me know that I'm comfortable with the bike. And then it's like, okay, well, I like the way the power comes on. I like the way this feels. Now it's like now I can dive in and learn it. But if I like the basics on a motorcycle, that's all I need to know.
So you said some limited tech. You said all the tech, I think, right?
Oh yeah.
I guess I'm gonna harp on something I've said before a number of times. This is the best time to be a motorcyclist. It's we have all of these crazy advancements coming out, and then we also have all of the old stuff available too. You can have a little bit of everything. So I guess my thought is I'd like some of everything. I'd like something that's got acetylene headlights in it. That's neat. I'd like something, I guess sort of middle of the road, I guess, where there's some technology. Maybe you've got a carburetor but electronic ignition, like I'm interested in that stuff. And then even the latest and greatest, all super whiz-bang stuff that I don't really even want to learn how it works and pull it apart the first time I have to service something that's broken, I'll give that a whirl too. I think that's kind of the nice part about motorcycles right now is we can have a little bit of everything.
Have one from every decade.
Yeah, so I would just have a little bit of everything. I don't know. It's let's have a little
Yeah, but
bit.
if I guess
It's a smorgasbord.
Yeah, but we're not talking. I mean, I guess really what the lens you're talking about this is like with new bikes, like you want more or less. And I think when I'm looking at the bikes that I'm buying now,
choice.
yeah, I mean, I'll take it. Like, and I do like the fact that I can turn it off. I can adjust it. I think adjustment's the big thing. I don't mind having the technology as long as I can fine tune it to work the way that I want to ride the bike.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Speaking of turning it off, I think it's about time. Let's get rid of that last card. Folks, thanks for joining us yet again for another Highside, Lowside. We've talked about tech, and we, as usual, just barely scratched the surface and didn't actually hash anything out. However, I expect some of you guys have some commentary. We will, as always, enjoy reading it. Please make sure that you get lots of comments in there about Spurgeon's AutoZone shirt. Also, your thoughts about tech on your own motorcycle or the motorcycles of others. And please, we'd love some good political conversation, so dump all that in the comments section as well.
And don't forget, we have the podcast too. So if you want to check out the podcast, you can just type in RevZilla wherever you get your podcasts and listen to Highside, Lowside in its entirety while you're driving or dropping the kids off at some swim practice.
Sounds pretty good. I'm going to speak for these fellas and sign out. For Spurgy, Joe, and me, Lem, we're out of here.